Welcome to this podcast on peace and politics. Please note that it was recorded before Hamas terrorists attacked Israel on October the 7th, 2023, and before Israel's prolonged bombardment of Gaza in the following months, so it makes no mention of these events. This latest devastating chapter in the long-running conflict between Israel and Palestine has profoundly impacted discussions of peace within local, national, and global politics all around the world, and this is something that we will reflect on in later podcasts. For now, in the absence of a ceasefire or any progress towards conflict resolution, we urge all politicians to work together to end the current violence so that those most impacted on all sides can begin to heal and rebuild their lives.
Hello and welcome to the Visualising War and Peace podcast. My name is Harris Siderfin and I'm a researcher at the Visualising Peace project here in St Andrews. Today, I'm going to be speaking to Lord Jim Wallace of Tankerness about his career and the relationship between peace and politics within the United Kingdom. Lord Wallace is a former Scottish Liberal Democrat politician and has served as a life peer in the House of Lords since 2007. He has held ministerial positions as Deputy First Minister of Scotland, Acting First Minister twice, Justice Minister, and Enterprise and Lifelong Learning Minister. He's also an advocate and a member of the King's Council and was also Advocate General for Scotland and Deputy Leader for the House of Lords during the UK coalition government. Lord Wallace stood down as leader of the Lib Dem peers in 2016, but retains an interest in human rights and constitutional issues in the Lords. He chairs the Regulation Board of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland and the Trustee Board of the international charity Reprieve. Lord Wallace has also been a long-standing elder in the Church of Scotland, and in 2021 he was appointed Moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, a role which has a year-length term. Welcome, Lord Wallace. You've obviously had a very long and successful political career. For my first question, I wanted to ask, what drew you into politics? What was that spark that made you want to be involved in the political world?
I've often said it was some personality defect. I was fascinated by politics, particularly by elections, as a kid. I remember in the 1966 general election, standing outside my primary school to get the autographs of the candidates who were coming to speak. And my father, recognising my interest, decided to take me to an eve of poll meeting of the Liberal candidate because he thought there wouldn't be many people there and it would probably be quite safe. Well, he subsequently did find out what the consequence of that was. But it was just something I'd been interested in, debating at school and going to university and becoming very involved in political societies, political debate there. And I discovered that the ideas I'd had and I'd formulated tallied very much with those of the Liberal Party, subsequently the Liberal Democrats. And I joined the Scottish Liberal Party when I was 17.
Can you tell me about how you found yourself in the world of politics? You were obviously a lawyer before you became a politician. And I was wondering if you could tell me about your career progression and how your interest in politics developed into you becoming a politician.
I was very interested in politics. I became the prospective candidate for my home area of Dumfriesshire when I was 21, and the general election of 1979, I fought Dumfriesshire as a Liberal and managed to save my deposit. So the deposit was at 12.5%. First time that had been done in that seat since 1945. And then I was immediately asked after the election if I would stand for the South of Scotland Euro constituency in the first ever direct elections to the European Parliament. David Steele, the party leader, asked me if I would stand, and I did. I was in the final stages of qualifying for the bar, so it was trying to juggle doing work as a devil to an advocate in the morning and afternoon and going to speak in public meetings in places like Eyemouth and Biggar in the evening. And from there on, I was a member of the Scottish Liberal Party executive. And when we entered the alliance with the SDP, the seats were divvied up between the two parties. And the SDP wanted to fight Dumfries. And for some reason, David Steele wanted to fight his own constituency, which was next door. That went to the Liberal Party. And I didn't actually have any seat to fight coming with the 1983 election looming. I was elected as the candidate for Orkney and Shetland in March 1983. I first ever visited Orkney and Shetland in January 1983, and by June I was a Member of Parliament, and the following month I got married. And my wife's view was that when we got engaged, she was getting engaged to an Edinburgh advocate whose hobby was politics, but he was a Liberal, so there was no chance of ever becoming an MP. And I still say she had 4 weeks to change her mind. I became an MP then at the age of, 28? Because there was only 17 of us, I think, at the time. We immediately got party spokesmanship. I was party spokesperson in Energy. And in 1985, I still remember very clearly, David Steele was in Orkney to do any questions. And my older daughter had just been born, and I was driving him to the Balfour Hospital. He said he would go and see my new daughter and Rosie. And on the journey, he said, I'm about to do a reshuffle. Would you like to become the party's defence spokesman and deputy chief whip? And this went drove off the road. And thereafter, I was chief whip in 1987 and was chief whip at the time of the merger of the Liberal Party and the SDP. And that was the first chief whip of the new merged Liberal Democrats, and became leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats in 1992. Thereafter, I decided to stand for the Scottish Parliament. It was put where your mouth had been to campaign for it, actually, to do it. I had to choose between fighting for Orkney or for Shetland. But Orkney would be our family home, so it was the obvious place to stand for. And I was duly elected in 1999 and served as a minister, sometimes as acting First Minister, until 2005, when I decided to stand down from ministerial office and to stand down from the Scottish Parliament at the ensuing Scottish election, whereupon I was made a life peer. So that's a very potted history of my political engagement.
And why did you decide to become a Liberal opposed to a Labour member or a Conservative member? How does the Liberal Party and now the Liberal Democrats align with your values on individualism?
Well, I think there's several things. I remember it was one of these things you formulated, or you worked out in your own mind what you thought were political answers or political ideas, then discovered. And I do remember that. I remember that happening with transport. You discovered that the Liberal Party's policy was one which you had actually worked out was quite a good, thoughtful policy. And also in the whole, as we still have the whole debate on the Constitution, the election meeting that my dad took me to in 1966, I remember the Liberal candidate there talking passionately about having a Scottish Parliament within the United Kingdom. And that seemed to me to make good sense. And the Liberal Party was committed to Scottish Home Rule within a United Kingdom. And I strongly subscribe to that and campaigned for it. And it was part of the Constitutional Convention and then campaigned for the referendum in 1997 that delivered it. And no one could have told me back in 1966 that I would actually sit in the first ever Scottish Parliament 33 years later, but that's what happened.
And you've stood in the three chambers, so you've been a member of Parliament, a member of the Scottish Parliament and in the House of Lords. How does that role within sort of political spectrum, how does it differ? How does it change? Is there a big difference between the three?
Oh, there are obvious differences between the three. The Commons is much more combative. The Scottish Parliament has become more combative, although when we set out, we quite deliberately chose a semicircle rather than the opposite benches as you get in the Commons, and indeed for that matter the Lords. The Lords has the cross benches, and the Lords is a far more genteel and polite place. When people ask me that question, I used to say the biggest difference for me was in my entire 18 years in the House of Commons, I sat in the opposition benches. In the Scottish Parliament, I sat always on the bench of the seats of one of the governing parties, and for 6 of the 8 years I was there as a member of that government. And then in the House of Lords, I've been both in opposition and in government. Quite frankly, the worst day in government is better than the best day in opposition.
How important is the sort of concept of peace within the UK and also within democracy? Because think about the democratic peace thesis, which is the idea that democracies tend to be more peaceful, and those two things go hand in hand. How important is peace within the agenda of British politics and throughout your career?
The issues of peace as such, as opposed to, we'll maybe come back to talk about specific wars and conflicts, but the issue of peace has not really loomed as large as you might think or wish, except with regard to Northern Ireland, if you talk about Britain. And it used to amaze me that actually we had what went on in Northern Ireland, the deaths and the violence in part of our country. And I'm not saying that successive governments ignored it, but really I would say until John Major took a very proactive interest, the governments had not engaged in Northern Ireland in a search, in a quest for peace, as they might have done. And obviously the work started by John Major was carried on by Tony Blair, with people like John Hume, David Trimble, and the Irish Taoiseach, and obviously the involvement of Bill Clinton was important too. And I think, we had debates on Northern Ireland, but it was only, I think, in fairness, when John Major became more engaged in it that you saw the first ceasefire around about 1994, 95, and then it led to the Good Friday Agreement. And that, I think, in terms of United Kingdom politics, is the was the key issue regarding peace. Or obviously, there were issues involving peace and conflict on a global scale, which were always, they came up in debates and issues. I mean, we tried to think back when I first was a member of Parliament. The Berlin Wall was still up. There was still an Iron Curtain across Europe. Apartheid was still rampant in South Africa. And these were all issues which, were fundamentally ethical issues and had a very important peace dimension. And they were, of course, part of the general debate. But sometimes these debates tend to be very limited to those who had particular, had their first-hand experience, particularly in terms of South Africa, people would be there, or were experts in their field. And I don't really recall the issues of peace as such being debated. We had the debates over the renewal of the at-sea nuclear deterrent when the government of the day decided to go ahead with Trident, and that was a major political debate. But you might say, well, that wasn't so much peace, but then arguably the deterrent, those who argue for the deterrent see it as an instrument of peace, attaining peace. But I don't think it was ever quite as fundamental an issue of debate as it probably was in the Northern Ireland context. But more generally, to answer the other part of your question, I think peace and democracy are vitally important to each other. I think democratic institutions, if they're working properly, because there's some places call themselves democracy, but they're not necessarily in fact, but if you've got proper democracy, then that should be the way of which community anxiety, community conflict, potential conflict can be resolved through the democratic process. And therefore, I think that democracy is an important form of government to try to help secure peace. I think, and it's the other way around as well. I think a peaceful nation facilitates a working democracy. It's a two-way thing. And I think we've been fortunate, certainly during my lifetime, of having had particularly a functioning democracy, which allows a proper outlet for those who are disaffected. Where I am concerned is and it's the UK, you might say it's also the United States, is almost the breakdown of civility in terms of the political dialogue discourse, which it's a simplistic thing to blame social media for that. But, before, if you had to go and look out the green ink and write a long letter to your MP, it's a different thing from being half cut at 1 o'clock in the morning and sending your MP a rather vitriolic text message or replying to something on Twitter or whatever we're supposed to call it these days, X. So I think we've got to watch out. You can't take it for granted, democratic institutions. You've got to work at it. And they can be fragile. And therefore, I think those engaged in the political process have got to be nurturing the democratic traditions and the democratic values, because I do think it's a good bedrock on which you can build a peaceful society.
Sort of building on that, do you think there has been a large shift in terms of how the democracy within the UK and the US has sort of changed since you went into Parliament till today? Rise of populism, sort of identity politics. Do you notice that in sort of your day-to-day political life?
Yes, I do. I mean, obviously, when you're in the House of Lords, it's not quite as vitriolic as it can be in the Commons, or for that matter, in the Scottish Parliament. But I see dialogue, or I see very senior politicians saying things which I could never imagine their predecessors in office saying, in terms of some of the bitterness that's there. And I don't think it's healthy. And I'm not quite sure how we actually go about changing it once the genie's out of the bottle. But I think we do need to be very careful. And I find having to check myself, temptation to reply to someone on Twitter. I think, no, that will not improve the language of politics. And I think we've all got to be aware of democracy is a bit of a tender plant, and you just shouldn't take it for granted. And I think if people start becoming more and more violent in their language, it makes it easier for those who would like to be more violent in some of the ways in which they would express themselves. And sadly, even during my time as being active in politics, we have seen assassinations, Ian Gow and Joe Cox, and then there was David Amos. And I mean, I knew David Amos. We were elected to Parliament the same day. We were little to share in common with him in terms of his party views, but he was a thoroughly decent person. He was someone who worked hard for his constituents, who never missed an opportunity to promote his constituency, be it Basildon and latterly Southend. And he was murdered, actually, doing a constituency surgery. And I'm not saying there was any one person or any tweeter that triggered the person who did that. But I think if you've got a more violent background in terms of language, it's probably not such a big step for someone to take in terms of actual violence.
Absolutely. And that sort of brings in the point of the difference within being an MP, a member of parliament, and that you as an individual, but then you having to represent individuals in democracy. If you could speak a little bit about that relationship.
I think it's important whenever fundamental questions come up about conflict that you try and become as informed as you can about it, and that you are guided by certain values. Now, it has happened during my time as a member of Parliament and subsequently in the Lords of Scottish Parliament. Of course, never had any responsibility for international relations, although we did debate the second Gulf War, which I'll say something about in a moment. But I mean, the first time I really had to vote on war as such was the first Gulf War. And that was a vote taken after the commitment to the troops going in had been made. And I was very conscious. I remember walking through the division lobbies in the Commons being very conscious that I was voting on something as fundamental as war. As it turned out, as it happened, I happened to be supportive of the government's position and indeed, fortunately, my own party's position, although I'm not sure it was the Church of Scotland's position, because I did think that Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, I mean, it was fundamentally wrong to national law. I would say as a lawyer, things like that matter of law, and that force trying to usurp law is never a recipe for lasting peace. And I therefore supported the UK's involvement in that. I actually supported George Bush Sr. when he said, Kuwait having been liberated, that he would not allow his troops to march on Baghdad because the mandate they had been honoured, had been fulfilled. And therefore to go further than that would not be right. And I think, therefore, did support what happened there. The other conflict, which I don't think ever got as much attention in the British House of Commons as it should have done, was the conflict in the Balkans and Bosnia in particular. My then party leader, Paddy Ashdown, was passionate on that subject. His questions, particularly to John Major, Prime Minister's questions, his challenges to Douglas Hurd, who was then Foreign Secretary, on the question of Bosnia and specifically on the massacre in Srebrenica. I mean, Paddy persisted in that, but never got that much support in his persistence. I mean, I'm not saying people were against what he was saying, but people weren't interested. And I think we know full well what happened. There was a dereliction of duty on the part of the UK government, and I was dare to say on the part of Parliament to take that conflict as seriously as it should. I have subsequently, through the Remembering Srebrenica organisation, visited Srebrenica and Bosnia, and it was a very profound experience, meeting the mothers who didn't have bitterness, they just wanted justice. They didn't want revenge, they wanted justice. And seeing the rows and rows of graves of people who had been massacred, and then their bodies had been really broken up and put into different landfill sites. So, because they knew the Americans were watching them on satellites, and therefore they thought they'd better destroy the evidence, as it were. And even this year, on the 11th of July, more bodies, or let's be frank, body parts, were buried. There were well over 8,000 men and boys who were massacred. And I don't think the UK Parliament at the time took that as seriously as it should. By the time 9/11 and Afghanistan and the Second Gulf War, I was not in the House of Commons any longer. Scottish Parliament did debate the Second Gulf War. We had freedom to debate what we liked. And I remember leading an amendment against the UK government's position, albeit we were in coalition with the Labour Party. And there was a clear division between the two parties in the coalition, but that was not a problem in terms of expressing our own view. But I also remember my colleague and friend Charles Kennedy being shouted down in the House of Commons when he tried to articulate a view in opposition to the UK's involvement in the Second Gulf War. And subsequently, as Advocate General for Scotland, I had to answer questions in the House of Lords on behalf of the Attorney General. And the Attorney General had obviously a role to play in some of the legal issues. And I do remember the debate we had on whether there should be a United Kingdom involvement after the Syrians used chemical warfare. Statement of the legal position was issued to MPs and peers, and I had to be pretty well briefed as to what the issues were. Should I be asked any questions on the legal position? And in the event, of course, the House of Commons defeated the government, and the coalition government were defeated on that, and we did not take action against against the Syrian government for the use of chemical weapons. But these were difficult decisions. Actually, I was clear in my own mind, but it was my own mind, and clearly other members of the House of Commons did have another view to defeat the government on it. But that's like the use of chemical weapons had crossed a red line, and you couldn't sit back and let it happen. But we did.
That must be the difficulty of being a politician, because you have your individual view, you have your constituents' view, but then you also have the party's view. And so trying to strike a balance between that must have been exceptionally difficult throughout these different conflicts. And as you said, even within the Trident debate, because it might be a deterrent, however, it's a nuclear weapon, which is offensive in its nature. And sort of just building on that, in your political career, the UK has been to war, as you were saying, in Bosnia, First and Second Gulf War, Afghanistan, and then most recently being involved in the Ukraine conflict. So in retrospect, what are your feelings towards these decisions? How quick or slow has successive UK governments been to commit military activity? And so how well understood would you say peacekeeping and peace building are within parliamentary circles? And to what extent is peace the priority when you're thinking about these political decisions?
I think things have changed. Even since I left the House of Commons in 2001, as I say, in 1991, on the first Gulf War, the commitment had been made before we actually had a chance to vote. But I think it was Tony Blair who did take a vote on engagement in the second Gulf War ahead of committing troops. And that then became understood as being what the norm should be. Although I think with an understanding that if things were an extremist and you had to do it very quickly without the chance of Parliament to meet, that would happen. I guess since it perhaps is beginning to drift back from that. Certainly, again, in terms of the Ukraine, I think the UK government has been responsible and fairly prompt. In fact, as prompt as any government in supporting the Ukrainians. So I think the UK government has generally been very supportive. But I think it was a welcome move that Parliament should be involved, because actually the declaration of war is a matter for the royal prerogative, which the Prime Minister exercises on behalf of the sovereign. But I do think having prior parliamentary approval strengthens the position. And I suspect strengthens the position, too, of those who are actually called upon to engage. And I think it was something we were always very clear about as a party in the second Gulf War, that although we opposed it, we were supportive of the troops who were then being asked to carry out the will of Parliament. And I think there's a distinction to be made between the principle of whether you support the war or not, and actually being supportive of those who are under orders to do what the government of the day has decided. One of the other conflicts was Kosovo and intervention in Kosovo. I think at the time it was a novel development in terms of humanitarian intervention. And I think you've got to be careful with that. I actually supported what was happening. Again, when you saw what was happening on the ground in Kosovo and some of the atrocities that were being committed or had the potential, even greater potential to be committed, that we were right to do so. Its foundation in international law was a bit shakier, but I think the concept of humanitarian intervention was one which being debated by international lawyers. I've sat through some of the interesting debates, not in the House of Commons or the House of Lords, but in academia on that. And I think provided that it is within proper bounds, it is a legitimate response. My concern would be if it's not kept tight rein on it, it could justify things which don't actually meet the test. So I think you've also got to be very cautious. And in terms of your own view vis-a-vis government and party, I was always brought up politically to believe that your first duty is towards the country, the second is towards your constituents, and the third is towards the party. And in those cases where, say, the country, where it's a matter of what the country should be doing, fortunately, I've always found myself on the same side as my party, and as far as I'm aware, over the years was on the same side as most of the majority of my constituents, although not necessarily universally, but I think most of my constituents shared the same view on these various conflicts, including the Second Gulf War, which stage I wasn't an MP, I was an MSP. I never felt an acute conflict with either my party or my constituents on these issues.
In terms of the second half of that question, is how well the ramifications of conflict or peacemaking or peace building, or how well is that understood by the individual MPs within parliamentary circles? Do you think they're well informed? As you said, earlier you had big briefs about the law behind it, but how well is it understood?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to generalise, but certainly when I was in the House of Commons, I think when you were dealing with these issues, literally issues of life and death, that people give it the seriousness and the attention which they merited. I mean, you can't ignore the fact that there are party whips operating, and Well, I think on the whole, people, MPs, do actually take it very seriously indeed. But again, going back to what I was saying earlier, I think my concern is that tribalism increasingly creeps into our political system. There must be a tendency, again, for MPs to take my tribe's view on this issue. And that, I think, doesn't leave as much room for individuals. Thinking that may be too much of a generalization. But I think when it's at high level, people do recognize the seriousness of it and give it the attention and that it merits.
Talking about post-conflict and peace-building and development work, to what extent is the UK's view on building peace after conflict? How important do you think peace and peace-building is within the UK's parliamentary circles?
I think it is of vital importance. Whether it is sufficiently given attention, I would hesitate to say it does. If somebody say Bosnia, I think we did take a genuine interest in the Balkans afterwards. Slow to come in, but there was a genuine interest, and certainly bias here because Paddy Ashdown was the first UN High Commission in Bosnia, and therefore I knew from first hand how seriously he took it. And it's supporting out from the UK government in doing that, and from the United Nations. Obviously, it was a UN appointment. But where we failed miserably was in having any plan for peace in Iraq after the Second Gulf War. I think that's now widely accepted that Saddam was removed, and then insufficient thought had been given to how then the peace should be won. And I think it's, going back to another question, it's sometimes maybe too easy to say, we'll just plant democracy. I think that became obvious. And of course, I don't go back on what I said. I think democracy and peace do march hand in hand. Whether you can suddenly impose democracy without trying to build up the infrastructure for it, the thinking of it and the ethos of it, I think raises certain questions. And I think that should be the direction of travel. But whether you can suddenly impose it, I think has begged questions. And clearly, what happened subsequently in Iraq showed that it wasn't necessarily possible. I mean, ISIS, there was a breeding ground. And I think that says if you don't have proper peacekeeping thought and attention and a plan for dealing with issues, for dealing with those who were engaged with the fallen regime, in ensuring there's proper infrastructure, ensuring you're addressing issues such as poverty and oppression, then you do find a breeding ground for organizations such as ISIS. Peacemaking, probably more difficult, but more essential than peacekeeping. Peacekeeping is probably the precursor, or the sine qua non for peacemaking. But peacemaking and things that go for peace are absolutely vital. And certainly in the Second Gulf War, we didn't. Question as to whether we left it a bit late in Afghanistan too. I mean, I was taken off the ball, in my view, when the invasion of Iraq took place. That again allowed a breeding ground for insurgents because we hadn't actually worked out how best to establish peace. And there's a responsibility, I think, if you go in, to actually have a proper plan as to how you might build the infrastructure which will facilitate peace.
So in terms of that and thinking long-term peace building, in your experience, has there been a difference between the priority between the Parliament in Westminster and the Scottish Parliament?
I think you've got to remember what the distinction is in terms of powers. The Scottish Parliament obviously doesn't have responsibility for defence issues. And as I say, we had a very good debate on the Second Gulf War, which was very serious. And again, I watched some of the proceedings of the Scottish Parliament. There seems to be far more point scoring now than there was in that particular debate back in 2003, which I think is regrettable. But I think there is a difference between if the Parliament has responsibility, as indeed has Westminster, than the Scottish Parliament. I don't want to gainsay that debate in 2003, and if you revisit it and look at the record, it was a very thoughtful debate and many thoughtful contributions. But you can't reduce these issues to a soundbite.
We've spoken most about peace being the absence of conflict, but looking at different types of peace, inner peace, mental health, these different sort of ways to view peace. You've been involved in the church throughout your life, holding the position of moderator of Church of Scotland. How do you think religion, politics and peace all come together in your experience?
Obviously, my views are very much influenced by my faith and my beliefs that blessed are the peacemakers. And I said it was peacemakers. But Jesus was a fairly disruptive figure in his own way too. I mean, he cleared out the temple of the moneylenders. But he was there to challenge. And I think sometimes religion has got to remember that it is there to challenge those who would abuse power and doesn't just become a centre of power itself. And I think that what's at the core of the Christian faith of love of God and love of one's neighbour is undoubtedly the best foundation for a peaceful society. But let's not kid ourselves that in pursuing that, it can be quite disruptive, because it does mean challenging vested interests, and it does mean removing complacency. But I do think it's very important, and I think there are issues which, given me a sense of what I want to see is in terms of, of justice. Now, be that social justice, be that justice in terms of the criminal law, be it justice in terms of tackling poverty. I think that's a key essential for establishing a peaceful society. I don't think you can have a peaceful society if there's rampant injustice. People who are minorities who are persecuted, even majorities who are persecuted, and if you've got lots of inequality. And therefore, I think addressing these is important in terms of trying to establish peace in not just a domestic community or a national community, but international community. I would argue one of the biggest threats, current threats to peace, apart from obvious places of conflict, is climate change. I mean, it's displacement of people because of severe weather, drought, and ensuing famine or flooding. I mean, that is quite potentially serious, because if you go back through history, through eons of history, it's people's conflict over land and challenging each other for land. It's always been a source of conflict. And I think we've got to find ways of managing not only climate change, but managing some of the consequences of climate change. And whether we're taking that sufficiently seriously as an international community, I'm not fully convinced we are. But I think is that in terms of faith and religion, it would actually highlight the need for justice as being a sine qua non if you're trying to establish a peaceful society.
In the role of moderator and within your religion, peace is a key part of that and part of the role. So last year, Moderator of Church of Scotland went with the Pope to South Sudan on a peace pilgrimage. How can religion be used as a vehicle for peace and best developed in that use?
I think the churches, and it's not confined to any denomination, or for that matter, other denominations, other faiths as well, can speak out for peace. When I was moderator, I co-signed a letter with the Pope Francis, and with the Archbishop of Canterbury to the leaders of it in South Sudan on the anniversary of their independence, just urging them to observe some of the things they'd committed to in terms of peace, because one of my predecessors had actually gone there with the Pope and the Archbishop, probably back in 2014 or 2015, to help promote peace and a better understanding among the communities, because there was a Roman Catholic population in South Sudan and an Anglican population, and there was, of the Protestants, the Presbyterian Church was the one that had the most adherents, and that's why the Church of Scotland was seen as being a partner in that drive for peace. And I think it was important that my successor as moderator and the Pope and the Archbishop went to reaffirm that commitment. And it's not a magic wand you can wave, but I think sometimes it's important to speak out. I don't know what conversations took place between them and the leaders in South Sudan, but I imagine they were fairly direct, and I think it carries some authority. And you pray and you hope that it will have some effect. And I think through history, the churches have been voices for peace. Sadly, too, there's sometimes been voices for conflict. Don't need to go too far back in the history books to see that the wars that were fought in the name of so-called religion, have scarred history. But working faithfully to the principles which Jesus proclaimed and displayed in his life, I think the church can be quite a profound body for promoting peace. And as I say, it's not unique to the Christian faith either. Other faiths also promote peaceful coexistence, peaceful pathways. One of the things I valued when I was moderator is the cross-interfaith work that does take place in Scotland. And oddly enough, it was COVID. COVID brought a lot of people together, because all of the different religions and faiths were experiencing the same difficulties and challenges as to how they continued and how they had their places of worship. So there was a lot of common ground and common understanding, and much of that has been built on. And I think that's very much to be welcomed, because I think when people of goodwill and faith are articulating a message of peace, it can carry some weight.
When we're thinking about peacemaking, how important are sort of non-state actors within that? So, for example, the power that the Pope has or the Church of Scotland in allowing peacemaking to occur. So you would have seen it in Northern Ireland, you would have seen it in Bosnia. That relationship between state and non-state actors, how important, in your experience, has those non-state actors been?
I think it is important, but I think I will make the point again that the church just saying it isn't good enough. It's got to be some outward show of it. And I think it can help shape the debate, and I think it can hopefully help change people's perceptions. I think one of the things which I was involved in during my year as moderator, and it was the agreement was signed in the year after I was moderator, was bringing together an agreement between the Church of Scotland and the Roman Catholic Church in Scotland. And if you think of the division and sectarian division that has been in Scotland over many years, I mean, you go back to the Church of Scotland's General Assemblies in the 1920s and 30s, and some of the things that were said about the Irish population, immigrants and Catholics, outrageous. They were anything but Christian. And we can't escape the fact that there's been a lot of sectarian bitterness in Scotland. And therefore, I thought it was important to respond to an overture from the Archbishop to try and see if we can actually foster better relations between the churches. And we did, and a declaration was agreed, because we agreed we would start by looking at the things we agreed on and not the things that we disagreed on. When we actually committed to paper the things we agreed on, it was very substantial and a very worthwhile agreement was reached. Now, I'm not saying that the day after that was signed, back in November last year, that peace and harmony broke out throughout Scotland, but I think it was important that we were seen to be doing that. And it does mean that within local congregations, local communities, if people do try to stir up the ante, you can say, well, hang on, your leaders are saying something completely different and actually showing where actually there's lots of common ground. And I think in ways like that, practical, but based on common values and common beliefs, is very worthwhile indeed.
When we're looking at peacemaking in the future, thinking about things like climate change, future conflict, what are the best vehicles for peace? How can we, as a society and community, sort of, do you think it's spoken enough about within the context and rhetoric within the UK at the moment?
I don't think it is spoken enough. I think part of the issue is that we have relatively enjoyed a long period of peace, in terms of our own domestic situation, Northern Ireland apart. I mean, my father was too young to have fought in the Second World War. My father did fight, and my grandfather fought in the First World War. But basically, since 1945, there have been conflicts, and can't diminish them. But those of us who have been at home and gone about our day-to-day existence of going to school, going to university, qualifying, doing working jobs, have not really had to think too much at first hand about the issues of war and peace. Now, for heaven's sake, I'm not saying we need a war to get people to think about it, but maybe you're right. Maybe it is the time to try and think of ways in which we can actually promote peace and the idea of what makes for peace at a time when there are these immediate threats. I mean, very often it is the immediate threat that prompts the thinking, but there's no better time than when you can do that thinking without there being an immediate threat, and look at the things that do make for peace. And I do think it involves justice, involves fairness, it involves equity, and tackling discrimination, and tackling poverty. And I think addressing climate change in a global sense. Globally, I have a real concern globally that some of our international institutions are not robust. Indeed, if they ever were fully robust, they were maybe never fully put to the test. But the United Nations, which, I would certainly say I'm a supporter of the United Nations, it struggles at times when the chips are down to actually make its voice heard. It's provided peacekeepers in certain places, very valuable, but it's not always the fact that it doesn't always seem to be able to intervene properly or bring about peaceful solutions. It's a concern. I can't think of a better organisation at the moment. We've got to work out how we actually better strengthen what is like the United Nations, and that might need some fundamental rethinking, and it's probably this is not the best time to do it. The conflict in Ukraine is not the best background for trying to give the United Nations more power, but in terms of things like tackling climate change, we've got to look at ways in which we can actually strengthen things like COP. I mean, I was present in Glasgow during much of COP26. I achieved something. I think there's a lot left to be desired, and subsequently too, in terms of some of the support that isn't required for developing countries to take action to address for compensation for addressing the damage that has already taken place. I think it's important, but also to make sure there's proper support and resource for countries most likely to be affected to take remedial action ahead of further damage. I mean, places like Bangladesh, which very much in the receiving end of storms and flooding, and we need to be able to actually address their needs more effectively. I think we're not going to do it other than through some international accords and international negotiation, but they've got to be given a lot more beef.
So how do we get peace to become a more central issue within the UK? Should we have a Minister for Peace or Peace Manifesto, which covers all different forms of peace, from conflict resolution to inner peace and mental health? How do we bring these issues to the forefront of British politics and public thought?
I think you've got to perhaps bring home more to people the importance of some of these issues. Mental health is a vitally important issue, and how you relate that to security, and there might be a way of doing that. And I think you've got to probably make the link between what are the bread and butter issues of political debate and the importance of peace to do that. Forgive me if I'm sceptical about creating departments. There is progress. I mean, when I was at school, primary school, we did have a Minister for War, a Secretary of State for War. We now have a Secretary of State for Defence. So that's some sort of progress. Whether a Secretary of State for Peace would make much difference. Other than the fact to perhaps make sure that within, maybe it is already the case, but you probably know better than me, that within some government department, FCDO's responsibilities, there is a responsibility for the promotion of peaceful activities. Maybe that's a better way of doing it, redesignating government departments. I've seen so many rejigs of government departments of different hues to be a bit cynical and sceptical about what it is. But I think perhaps giving someone a responsibility within government for making these links and just showing how so much of what we do, and that includes issues relating to climate change, do actually matter for peace within our communities and indeed more globally.
My final question to you, if you were to go around and do it all again, or were encouraging a young person who wants to go to politics and make a difference and inject peace into the political mindset of Westminster or within the country, what would you do differently? How would you approach it today?
I find that a really difficult question because, I'm a product of when I was your age. We could never have a conversation like this over Zoom because, it was on the very first weeks of the pandemic where I got an email from someone in the Church of Scotland wanting to talk to me on Zoom. I still have my reply, which is, what is Zoom? I think the point I'm trying to make is it's a very different world. People are the same. Human beings are basically fundamentally the same, but operate in a completely different context. We need good people to go into politics. Let's not kid ourselves. If you don't have good people in politics, you leave the field to those sort of more malign instincts. That's not healthy. But you need a pretty thick skin, to deal with some of the stuff that goes on today. And that's why I think I said earlier, we need to be very careful as to how we nurture democracy and nurture our political institutions and try and promote a better sense of decency. I don't expect people to be gentle. I don't, because some of the issues we're talking about are issues which quite properly evoke passion, but there's ways and ways you do it. I don't necessarily detect the friendships across parties, or even the good acquaintanceships across parties that were there 40 years ago when I was first elected as a member of Parliament. And maybe it's for those of us who are that bit older to do what we can to try and promote these ideas, these thoughts, the approach, which would then encourage younger people to come into politics. But I couldn't put my hand on heart and say to someone who's 22, go and get a political career, because it could be pretty tough. But you do need thoroughly decent people doing it. So maybe it's incumbent on us in a slightly older generation to do what we can to try and shape a climate which decent young people would want to become associated with.
Well, thank you so much, Lord Wallace, for this really interesting conversation.
And a big thank you also from me, Alice Koenig, the director of the Visualising War and Peace project. That was a wonderfully wide-ranging and reflective conversation, which touched on a range of issues that the Visualising Peace project has been researching lately. The still limited discussion and visibility of peace in different parliaments, for example, and the need for more attention to be paid in political debates about how to build peace, not just maintain it. Also, the connections that Lord Wallace mentioned between peace and justice, peace and equal rights, these are very much things that we've been looking into, and the ways in which poverty and climate change, among many other things, can threaten peace. And it's a very timely conversation also because the Visualising War and Peace team has recently embarked on some research in dialogue with the Young Academy of Scotland's Responsible Debate project, which in fact Lord Jim Wallace contributed to at its inception, on the relationship between responsible debate and conflict prevention, conflict resolution, and conflict transformation. And we're partly trying to address habits of debate that polarize and divide and drive conflict, but our project is also experimenting with different ways of disagreeing better on challenging issues, listening open-mindedly, learning about other people's perspectives, using language to unite rather than divide, addressing power imbalances in debating structures, and finding common ground and shared purpose as we work collaboratively towards solutions rather than trying to win the argument, as it were. So it was really fascinating to hear Lord Wallace's reflections on increasingly combative debating cultures within politics and the need for more collaborative, peace-oriented modes of dialogue. So thank you once again to both Lord Jim Wallace and Harris Siderfin for hosting. And also thank you very much to you, our listeners, for joining us again. We do have more podcasts coming up by members of the Visualising War and Peace project, so please keep an ear out for them. And please do tell family, friends and colleagues about our podcast to spread the word. If you would like to join the conversation further, you can follow us on social media. Just search for Visualising War or Visualising Peace, or get in touch directly by emailing us at vispeace@standrews.ac.uk. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. The show was mixed by Harris Siderfin, with topping and tailing by Zafir Gertin. Thank you for listening.